Okay, thank you for that. Item 3 is an update on the landfill fire, and I'll turn it over to staff at this time.
Fire Chief Rocca will kind of introduce the team that's here this evening, and we'll make a presentation, and then we'll take questions from council, and then Mayor, it's up to you to invite any public comment at that point as you see fit.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, city staffers. As the city manager indicated, we wanted to provide you with a bit of a three-pronged approach here in terms of a landfill fire update. And so I'll just start out with the initial alarm. It was on May 26, 2012 at approximately 6:41 p.m. that the fire department received a report of a fire at the landfill, which is located at 3900 Hebel Avenue, southwest in Iowa City. The initial response was made by Quint 2, which was a 3-person engine company. It would have had a lieutenant and 2 firefighters on there. As they approached the landfill site, they noticed a large column of black smoke, similar to what you see there, but probably not quite as advanced at that point. And they immediately upgraded their response to include an additional engine company, a truck company, and a battalion chief for more personnel. When they arrived on scene, after making access to the landfill, they were coordinating with landfill employees and staff at that time. And I might add that it's an easy question, I guess, to ask at this point, but I'm going to ask it, and it's why let the landfill cell burn? Well, the initial incident commander saw the fuel that was involved, how rapidly it was spreading, and made a very good decision to try to cut the fire off. And so coordinating between Superintendent Dave Elias and Lieutenant Scott Duvall, they identified an area where they could make a fire break, and they were using heavy equipment to try to separate the burning material from the unburned material. Despite some of their best efforts early on, we had fire migrate across the fire break, and of course we had to kind of back up, and we took an additional run at establishing that fire break. Again, with limited staffing, limited fire suppression capabilities, the decision to let the cell burn and try to separate it from the unburned material was a very good decision early on. I want to talk a little bit about what's gone on. Clearly we've had staff present out there, numerous staff from fire and landfill working day to day. And through that, we identified, the Public Works Director and I identified on Saturday the need to open up our incident command post. Many of you that have been around for a long time know that many lessons have been learned from our tornado in 2006, our floods in 2008, of how we approach response and recovery to disasters. And so we used a lot of the lessons learned from those 2 incidents and opened up our command post on Sunday, the 27th of May. It really became operational the next day, but we just wanted to be ahead of that. The incident command system, as you know, is really not an option. It's required by a presidential directive in how we respond to and deal with these types of emergencies. When Public Works Director Foss and I initially discussed how we were going to approach the coming days, it was clear that a lot of the detail that he was going to be involved with wouldn't allow him to focus on the strategy that was going to come to play over the next several days and continues as we speak. So we had an agreement, and ultimately I was appointed as incident commander of the incident, and that occurred, I believe, on Monday. And so we went ahead and abandoned our unified approach with fire and public works, and I took over those duties as incident commander. When we did that, we identified 3 incident priorities, and they are still active and current today. The first has to do with safety. Our first priority clearly is safety, that of the public and personnel, whether it's fire personnel, landfill personnel, or contract personnel. The next priority has to do with fire containment and control, and ultimately extinguishment, which I know we all want. Let me briefly break down some of the structure that we've got with the incident command system. The command staff personnel that I have available to me, one of those positions is a public information officer. And I want to credit our assistant to the city manager, Jeff Fruin, for all his proactive actions. He's taken on the media contact, our contact with the general public. Our website, as you well know, is equipped with frequently asked questions and is updated routinely. We have a presence on on Facebook, so we're able to push out a lot of information very quickly. And I know he worked very hard and long hours coordinating all that information with the Johnson County Public Health Director, Doug Beardsley. And Doug's here tonight, and of course you'll hear more from him later. But once again, Jeff, I want to publicly thank you for all the efforts you put into our media relations. You've done a fantastic job. Moving along, the general staff that I have to work with, our Public Works Director, Rick Foss, is our Operations Section Chief. And so Rick really is kind of where the pulse of the operation is. He's working with fire. He's working with all his divisions within Public Works. He's working with the Health Department, the Finance Department, Planning Section Chief, and I'll step through that. But that's really the hot seat, but he needs to be involved with that so we can move forward on ultimately the extinguishment of this fire. The Administrative Section Chief, of course, is our City Manager, Tom Marcus. We've kept him abreast of this on an ongoing basis. He continues to provide us with excellent direction. A lot of questions have surfaced during our briefings and planning meetings, and he's done a fabulous job of providing the direction that you would expect of him. Of course, there's a finance aspect to this, and our Finance Section Chief has been split up between Kevin O'Malley, the Finance Director, and Melissa Miller, our Risk Manager. Both doing an admirable job of making sure that we have the resources that we need available to us and that they are paid for. As I mentioned, we have a Planning Section Chief. Our Deputy Chief, Roger Jensen, is doing that. He kind of looks at the day's activities and tries to pick out some of the problems, maybe issues and concerns that we're likely going to anticipate, and he tries to forecast those in issues for us to discuss, as well as plans for the next operational period, which would be the following day. Roger's well-versed in the incident management structure as he's part of the Iowa Incident Management Team, and he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to us in that regard. We have a number of branch directors, too. Our on-duty fire battalion chief continues to monitor the day-to-day activities of the fire department throughout the city, as well as coordinating actions at the landfill, particularly on the cell that's involved right now. Our Public Works branch director is Ron Kanoki, the city engineer. Again, he's kind of more down into the details of whether it's the landfill cell or wastewater treatment issues and some of those implications, and I'm sure Rick will talk a little more about some of that. A very important component of our branch directors has to do with public health. Mr. Doug Beardsley from the Johnson County Health Department early on was contacted to provide direction. Obviously, we had concerns about air quality and air monitoring as we lead back to our incident priority of safety. And Doug clearly has stepped up. He's brought a tremendous amount of knowledge, wealth of knowledge, experience, and quality equipment to the table. And I know he has a lot that's going to be very enlightening for the public and those here tonight to hear about. Doug's just done a tremendous job in that regard. When I look at the law branch, Captain Weiss from the Iowa City Police Department has been involved from the beginning, looking at the issues with smoke propagation and potentially needs for evacuation and trying to stay ahead of it, scene security at the landfill itself. And so you can see there are a lot of people come together from a city perspective, and I'm going to expand on that a little bit because the next piece of information I want to share with you has to do with the Johnson County Emergency Management Agency. Dave Wilson's our coordinator. Really, everything that we've done to date, reaching out to many agencies, and I'll get to those in a minute, all are possible because of our emergency management coordinator. As you know, Mayor Hayek put together a declaration, state of an emergency for the city. And once we did that, at Dave Wilson's recommendation, many additional resources have come through at our disposal. And I'll get into some of those here in just a little bit, but any additional requests for staff, for equipment, for fire suppression agents, for water, for foam, for communications equipment, on and on. Again, the emergency declaration was guided by Mr. Wilson, and we have access to county, state, and federal resources as a result of his actions early on. So Mr. Wilson clearly has done a marvelous job on behalf of the city of Iowa City. I want to move into operations and research here briefly. I want to say that the decision to let the fire burn isn't an easy one because we're really looking at a number of issues there. If we were to have access to a lot of water or fire suppression agents or surfactants, and we went ahead and put those on that cell, we could have risked probably running additional oil, water, suppression agents into the groundwater, and then we'd have the whole runoff issue to contend with. So again, back to the decision to let it burn. Granted, we have particulate in the air, we have other issues that we're monitoring for, but really when we looked at all the research that was available to us, some of this from the United States Fire Administration, entitled, they had a study entitled Scrap and Shredded Tire Fires, an excellent resource for us to go to. Also, a tire fire report from the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment was a tool used early on, not only by the Incident Command Team, but Mr. Beardsley, as he looked at what toxins could be produced by the fire, what would we need to monitor for, where should we be monitoring. So some excellent resources in that regard. Another question that probably has been asked numerous times out in the public is, why don't you just extinguish the fire? Well, we've done some testing on Class A foams with limited sustainability. A small quantity in a test area, we applied the Class A foam, and while it suppressed the surface area, the flame production, within 10 to 20 minutes it was starting to degrade. Fire and smoke was starting to pop through. And when we look at the amount of Class A foam and water necessary to extinguish the fire, we weren't sure we would have sufficient quantities of either to be able to do that effectively and for a sustained period of time. We've also been pre-planning for the deployment of Class B foam. Class B foam is used on flammable liquids. We are generating some pyrolytic oil as a result of this fire, and hence we have a liquid that we're contending with here. And so we're trying to be ahead of that to look at fire suppression needs in the event that we have an ignition, an ignition of that oil. So we also reached out to the EPA, as I mentioned earlier, and the Environmental Protection Agency came to the scene purposely for air monitoring, and they came out of the Kansas City office, Region 7. Through the monitoring, they were able to assist Mr. Beardsley and others that I'll mention here in a minute with the air monitoring. But we talked to them, given their experience, hands-on experience with these types of fires. And one gentleman recommended what we refer to as the stir, burn, and cover method. He said, we've seen a lot of situations where, whether it was Class A foam, surfactants, wetting agents have been applied, and they've been largely ineffective. They believe, it's their opinion, that we're on the right track, again, with the stir, burn, and cover. They also recommended a number of contractors that we could work with. We contacted one of those. We are presently under contract with Environmental Restoration out of the St. Louis and Kansas City area, and we'll speak a little bit about what's going on there. The city's reached out and cooperated with a number of agencies, and I just want to kind of highlight those once again for you. First of all, most of this was made possible by the emergency declaration by our mayor on June 1st. Multiple city departments and divisions have been involved, and I can tell you, be very proud of the effort, the late hours, the sleepless nights that many of our employees from many departments and divisions have put into making this a successful operation. Johnson County Resources, I mentioned, Dave Wilson, our emergency management coordinator, has been stellar with his ability to provide resources to the community. Doug Beardsley, the Johnson County Health Department Director, as well, stellar with his air monitoring and reaching out, coordinating with Lynn County Public Health Department. The state of Iowa has a number of resources involved in this. The Department of Natural Resources out of the Washington, Iowa office early on was contacted as a resource and had an on-site presence about every other day to monitor the operations here. A number of items have been sent to the State Hygienic Laboratory for analysis to include some of our air monitoring. We've had to reach out to the Iowa National Guard 71st Civil Support Team for some modeling and hazmat expertise, as well as the federal level. As I mentioned, the United States Environmental Protection Agency out of Region 7, the National Guard, who also has at the federal level, a federal branch of the Guard, has been doing some plume modeling for us, and of course the National Weather Service. As I begin to wrap up, I just want to let you know that the incident command post briefings continue each day. We We congregate in there at 8 a.m. All of the section chiefs, branch directors, and other city staffers are available to kind of hear firsthand where we're going, what our obstacles are, and what it is we need to do during that operational period. We also have operational planning meetings at the end of each day to kind of evaluate some of those activities. Were we successful? What needs to happen? What are the priorities for tomorrow? And I can tell you that we do have some issues that we're currently dealing with. As we all know, community-wide, fire and smoke. We're ever so cognizant of the prevailing winds. We're trying to coordinate our on-scene efforts at the landfill cell to minimally impact the public to the best of our ability. And we continue with the stir, burn, and cover strategy as we work with our contractor out there as well as city staff. The pyrolytic oil production continues and likely will continue to a degree, although we hope it will lessen with the stir, burn, and cover strategy. But the production, storage, and ultimate removal of that oil is a critical thing for us to move forward on, and quickly, I might add. So we'll continue with those incident priorities that I outlined earlier. Safety will remain the #1 incident priority, that of our public and that of our personnel. We will continue to work to contain the fire and ultimately control the fire, and as we work towards extinguishment. That concludes my remarks right now, and so I'll go ahead and turn the podium over to Rick, and we'll move forward from there.
Thanks, Andy. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is take you through the operational end of it and show you firsthand some of the things that are happening in the field out there. The picture that you see now, thank you, Marion, is as it looked when I arrived Saturday night out there. And what you see burning is not garbage, but it's the liner system in the landfill, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. I want to begin by just getting you oriented to the fire location, which is crosshatched here. It's right in the middle of our 200-acre site out there, of which about 125 acres are currently landfill. We have 17 cells. This newest cell, it's kind of a pie-shaped piece here, is about 15 acres, and the bottom, or the southern half of it had been covered with garbage, but the north half had not, and that's where the liner was vulnerable to fires, and that's what we saw here. So as I said, what you see burning is the liner system. And what I want to review with you is how that liner system is constructed. And follow me through here. I want to point out that this drawing is not to scale, so pay attention to the dimensions that I talk about. At the bottom, you have the native soils out there. And the first layer is 6 inches of granular base, and that is to keep groundwater from penetrating up into the landfill cell, actually. And then on top of that 6 inches is 4 feet of compacted clay. And on top of that is a 60 mil high-density polyethylene plastic liner. On top of that is a geotextile composite. And on top of that is 12 to 36 inches of tire-derived aggregate, or shredded tires. And then the waste goes on top of that. Part of the reason for the aggregate in there is to allow the leachate that comes out of the out of the garbage to travel horizontally and get into the leachate collection system. And the question you're probably asking yourself now, given the vulnerability that we've seen to fire, is why use shredded tires for this? And it's an industry trend that started back in the mid-1990s. We've been using shredded tires since 1996 in a number of cells. And it besides having the vulnerability to fire, it has some very good physical characteristics for us. That is that it provides the drainage we need better than sand, and it's also more structurally stable than sand is, especially on the slopes, because underneath it, remember, it's that slippery plastic layer that the sand tends to slide down, and it's hard to keep it up there, whereas the tires stay put, and they also stay put when we put the garbage in place. So that's a little bit of the background about the how the liner is built. So let's take a look at things in more detail. What you see here is our staff working with the fire department to implement the strategies that Andy was talking about, where we're trying to cut off the fuel source from the fire. It's a similar strategy that you would apply to a grass fire. And the hard part about this strategy is you've got to pick where you're going to do that and cut that line. And it takes about 2 hours to build that line. And not having much experience with tire fires, and the effects of the winds that we were experiencing that night, the fire did beat us to the center. We were building from the north and south. We did not get it complete in that first containment line. Our guys worked as long and hard as they could on that first containment line, but ultimately the fire breached it, and we had to fall back and work on a second containment line on Saturday night. This is just a shot of the fire department and the landfill staff working together out there. I also want to point out that we had one staff member from our streets department out there that has heavy equipment experience, was helping out that evening. Here's a couple firefighters and Dave Elias, our landfill superintendent, actually going down into the landfill cell, because there's no substitute for the information that you get when you go down in there to see just how to strategize against this thing. I cannot overstate the skill and the effort that our staff put in that night. They really pushed themselves and their equipment to the limits there. It was necessary to come up out of the cell and allow the cooling systems on the equipment to catch up, and then they could also regain their bearings on where the fire is and the things that they're doing before they returned back into the cell. To make things even more scary out there is there were flame tornadoes that were roaming the site, 2 or 3 at a time, just because of the intensity of the fire and what all was burning out there. It was like being on a different planet. This is a shot a little around midnight after the second containment line had been built and was holding well. And that's our landfill superintendent, Dave Elias, on the left, and Ron Kanucky, our city engineer, on the right, just strategizing for the next day. And the second containment line that we built held until the wind shifted the next morning, and then that containment line was breached about 9 o'clock. Staff worked to build a third containment line, again, working in the wind, and that one was breached as well. And a fourth containment line ultimately contained a fire. So you can see that containment line here, and all of these tires that you see over here, tire chips, were saved from the fire. So that part of the liner system was saved. And that's a good part of what we've spent the past week on, is getting those unburned tires up out of the cell so that they no longer are a concern for catching on fire and spreading that further. This is Dave Elias taking a representative from the DNR down in to survey things. This is the morning after 2 days after the fire. Andy talked a little bit about the fire suppression strategies, and I just wanted to show you firsthand how that worked. And this area here was an area where they applied 750 gallons of water with Class A foam mixed with that. It suppressed the fire temporarily, and within a few hours, it was back. And what you see in the fireman's hand here is a thermal imaging camera. And it's difficult to see over his shoulder here, but you can see the hot spots that are back, and the scale is over here, and that's reading at 1,200 degrees. So that area right there that you're looking at is 1,200 degrees, and it had just had 750 gallons of water put on it just a short time before that. So that puts into perspective trying to deal with this type of fire with water. It's really not a practical thing to do. And that's why we're in a situation where we have a continued burn going on for some period of time. But the fire is only part of what we're dealing with out there. We're also dealing with the fire byproducts, and that is the runoff from it, the pyrolytic oils. And if there's any good news in this, if you're going to have a tire fire or tire chip fire, a landfill cell is a good place to do it, because it has that 4-foot clay liner underneath it. It has a drainage system built into it. It has a collection system, so that runoff is going into our leachate collection system and over to our lift station that pumps it into town to be treated with our regular leachate from the landfill. But what we quickly learned is that this is an oily substance that we really don't want to pump into town. It's not appropriate for treatment in our wastewater facility. And the good news there is that it separates from the regular leachate, kind of like oil and vinegar and a salad dressing. So we're looking down into the lift station now, so we allow that to sit still for a while it separates, and then we pump the pyrolytic oils off, and we put them in the leachate lagoon that we have out there. Again, another very handy facility for this type of thing. It's got the same HDPE liner in it and 4 feet of clay underneath that. Now, it was not possible to keep all of the oils from going through the lift station. So some oils were getting through the lift station into our sanitary sewer system. And where they pooled, and this is a good thing, they all pooled at the Napoleon Park Lift Station wet well. That's a place where we pump sanitary sewage to lift it up so it can continue on its way to the south wastewater plant. And that wet well just created a natural trap for it there. So we're able to go down and retrieve that, put it in a truck, and then bring it back and put it into the lagoon where we want to contain it. So fortunately, we had a lift station along the way that acts as a natural trap for it. Let's go back to the fire now. This is how the fire looked yesterday morning on day 8. And it looks as if it's burning out. It's looking pretty good. But I want to drill down and look at, here's a row of tires that are from that second containment area that I talked about. And if you go down and look more closely, you'll see that there's still some flames on there. And there's a lot of unspent fuel in there, and that's where the stir, burn, and cover strategy comes from. And yesterday afternoon, the contractor that we hired from St. Louis, Missouri, Environmental Restoration, came up and started to implement that strategy for us and began to stir those piles. And as soon as those piles are disturbed, they flare up very quick, and that's why you're seeing more smoke out there yesterday evening and all day today. And in that first pile that he broke open, the heat release was enough that it cracked the windshield on the excavator and melted some of the insulation around the window. So that suggests that it would have been nicer to wait longer to implement the strategy, but we have a good stretch of weather ahead of us, and we want to take advantage of that. And so we are stirring, burning, and covering right now. Here's part of the covering activity as it started last night. They were working out there, and where the fire has burned down to the point that we believe that we can cover it without risk of reignition when we uncover it in a month or two from now. That's when we place the soil on it. And that's really the tough judgment call that has to be made out there over the next few days is when are we to a point where we can bury that, because we don't want to deal with flare-ups later. It's very possible that we will, but we want to minimize that to the extent possible. So this is last night working out there. They worked till about 7 and had a north wind, so they're working at the north end. You always need to work with the wind at your back. Today they worked at the south end. Again, stirring, burning, and covering. All together, last night and today, they have stirred about 2 acres and covered about 1 acre. So of the 7.5 acres of burn area, we're about 1/7 into it. And how fast we ultimately get through that depends on 2 things. One is the rate of burn, and second is the weather over the next few days. Let's see. I think I'll just move on to this point and turn it over to Doug Beardsley. I'm sorry, I do want to back up and cover one thing. In the top of this picture, what you can see are regular landfill operations. So we are able to open up an old landfill cell and continue to accept garbage from our commercial and municipal haulers. And we actually have 2 locations functioning out there. So depending on which way the wind's blowing, it may take smoke over one, we have to move to another. If we have a bad day where it's covering the scale house or covering both of these areas, we've made arrangements with Lynn and Iowa counties. So our commercial haulers will go to Lynn County, our municipal haulers will go to Iowa County. So that's how we're working on operations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Good evening. Thanks for this opportunity to be here. I'll just get right into it. When I got the call, well, first of all, I noticed that, and I anticipated. I told my wife I'll probably be getting a phone call with that much smoke out there. True to form, I got a call Saturday night from the chief. Started doing some research right away. So I knew the 2 questions that were going to be asked is what's in the smoke and is it going to affect my health, or how will it affect health? So doing a lot of research, having a little bit of background, but really diving in on a very steep learning curve, reached out to our partners to the north in Lynn County. They have an air quality program that they run. It's federally approved. Have some great resources there. Asked about messaging. They've had some similar experiences up there with industrial fires, similar fires, not exactly tire fires, but similar fires. And through their research, investigations, and sampling, we discussed immediate messages that we could get out. And that immediate message was, smoke is a health hazard, and you should reduce your exposure to it to the extent possible, particularly for vulnerable populations, and we've outlined that in the message that has come out. Again, we reached out also to our partners at the State Hygienic Lab, who are just tremendous in providing support, going the extra mile any hour, day and night. I won't get into all, I could get into that later. But basically, the message is all smoke contains a variety of chemicals and particulates. There's been a lot of research done on tire fire smoke. There are carcinogens in it. There's irritants in it, and particulate matter. The real crux is, what dose are you getting? How long is it that you're exposed? A lot of things have to be taken into account there. So, but reading through past experiences, reports, and studies that have been done on other fires, it became apparent that all of the conclusions were the primary health concern with fires, any fires, whether it's forest fire or an oil fire, essentially what this is the particulate matter. That's the issue of most concern, and that causes acute or short-term problems, particularly those people who might have respiratory, underlying or pre-existing respiratory issues such as asthma or COPD, emphysema, those types of things. People with chronic heart disease, very young children who have developing lungs still and are usually more active on a ratio to body weight and lung size, the elderly. And we also threw in that doesn't sound good. We also included pregnant women in that because there's some very remote evidence about mutagenic properties. The conclusions of the research and health assessments on other large tire fires similar to this, larger ones, is the long-term effects really are negligible. Again, while the smoke is bad and those things are, there's bad chemicals in there, when you take it on the scale of by the time it gets to populated areas and with shifting winds, and the amount of those chemicals that are being deposited, on the assessment, there just hasn't been a noticeable increase in risk. There's always risk out there, but just no evidence, good hard evidence that would point to that there's going to be a long-term risk. So the messages was always turned back to the short-term risk. So avoid exposure, avoid any unnecessary exposure. Sheltering in place would be adequate. And just taking those extra steps, not being active while the smoke plume, while you're in the smoke plume. We consulted again with our partners up in Lynn County. We spoke with our air quality experts at the Department of Natural Resources. We had the EPA in with experts reviewing two things. We were sending them data. We did get some equipment from Lynn County, some handheld equipment. The hygienic lab was out taking samples, doing various analyses on that, primarily looking at particulate matter and our VOCs, volatile organic compounds, which are constituents of any combustion. We were feeding that data to the partners and discussing, here's our health message, is that adequate? Here's our sampling strategy, is that adequate? Do you have recommendations? There was good concurrence all along the way. When EPA was here, we shared our data again and continued on with the strategy. Our strategy was to try to catch the plume, go out at various distances. The data that we were able to collect confirmed the things that we had discovered through the research, that the VOCs and other compounds quickly dissipated as you got distance. The particulate matter varied. It didn't go on it hasn't heard of the bell curve. It was kind of up and down, but that's a lot to do with the weather, how the wind currents are going along. If you watch a smoke plume, sometimes it spreads out this way, other times it's rolling along. So you go out and you grab samples, you try to do timed samples, and various techniques to get the best information. But all of that supported the messages. We were continually wanted to be sure that we had the right message coming out, and those messages held throughout, and they will continue to hold till the operation is done out there. We've also, I do want to mention, we've had some folks from the University of Iowa Department of Chemical and Biochemical Engineering who we've got some real actually top national experts on air quality here in Iowa City who volunteered to do what they could to drop some of the work that they were doing and get their graduate students and staff. So they were out and they were doing a lot of monitoring with sulfur dioxide. And that's one of the big things that you smell. And particulate matter. They reviewed our data, and we've been sharing all that back and forth. They concurred that the environment or the health messages are appropriate based on what they're finding as well. We should have additional information later on what we call PHAs, or I'm going to try to sound intelligent here. I'm going to read it. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's where you'll find your carcinogenic, your cancer-causing chemicals. Those tests take a lot longer. They've had some ongoing collection sites for their normal work, and so they'll be sharing data. But all of the research, again, the reports, there's quite a few reports out there of analysis of soil and plants afterwards, that the level of the pH in the soil many times was below detectable levels, or at levels far below any actionable levels to attribute additional lifetime risk. So that's the good news. I'm not saying that smoke's good for you. It's bad. You should avoid it. But it's really that short-term risk that we're most concerned about. Have been in touch pretty much on a daily basis with the hospital ERs, and none of them report any elevated traffic, respiratory or cardiac. Otherwise, it seems like it's business as usual, so that's good news. Also, just when we talk about particulate matter, and levels, the research really tells us that it really needs to be at elevated levels for a prolonged period of time. So you're looking at 1, 2, or 3 days continuous exposure at very high levels, generally before you start getting a lot of those symptoms. And again, people are individuals. Some people are going to experience symptoms long before others. So that's stirred into the mix too. So that's what I've got, and I assume we're going to take questions at this point now.
I'm sure.
As they're all coming up, I wanted to point out Dave Wilson did join us. He's in the far corner back there. Raise your hand, David, so that everybody can see who you are. I think the other thing that's important to note is Andy mentioned a lot of people in the city operation by name and by position, and what you should understand is that to keep the operations going in a time like this, when you have a big part of your operation dedicated, takes all of those other people that take on more responsibilities too, and they did that. And you should be very proud of your staff, the way they stepped up to this and kept services going.
I told Rick to remind me to say this. I want to echo what the chief said about your incident command structure. I don't want to say it's been a joy working on this, but they have been very efficient. The cooperation, even when I've reached out, everybody's been working very well together. Your incident command structure works very well, and it was a good experience for me. I can take that back and add that into our incident command should we ever have to use that again in public health.
So we're ready to answer any questions of the council, and we also have our finance director here in case there's questions about finance issues and that sort too.
I'm sure there will be questions from the council. I do want to preface our questions with a collective thank you from the City Council regarding the response of staff, not only at the city, but at the county and at all other levels of government and in the private sector, the collective response to this. I think that this has been a very transparent and proactive handling of this very unfortunate incident. And it's clearly been a top priority of those involved, the city, the county, everyone else. And you've described sort of around-the-clock efforts that are ongoing to combat this. I know through my position that even those who aren't out there every minute of the day are still working actively on these issues. The upper echelons of our command structure are meeting twice a day, 7 days a week. There's constant communication on this, and regular communication to the council as well with updates. And what this comes down to is that this is a community issue, and I think the approach thus far has kept the community apprised of the risks, of the progress being made, and of the critical issues. And I think that's extremely important. As we deal with something that's affecting the broader community, not just Iowa City, but out into the county. So I applaud your efforts, and we know and expect that they will continue until this is behind us. So with that, why don't we open this up for questions from the council?
I had a question regarding and I went out there on Thursday, toured the area. It was remarkable seeing it. I think your pictures even captured it even better. I think the stress and nature of what was going out there for your staff, commending you all. White smoke versus black smoke. I noticed in some of the pictures there's a different color of the smoke. I assume the white smoke is a higher combustion. I was wondering, is the color of the smoke suggest that is burning faster, and is it burning safer? And is there anything that informs us as to the nature of mitigation efforts?
I'll begin by talking what happens operationally when you see the different colors of smoke. Over the past week, as the fire remained undisturbed, the smoke changed color from dark black to the white. As we do the stern burn, it turns black again. So once you expose new fuel, rapid combustion, that's when it turns black, and you've probably noticed that both last night and today. So I'll let Doug talk a little bit about the difference of the content.
Well, that'll be a short answer. Is I don't know for a fact. The research just talks about the constituents of tire smoke, so it doesn't talk. I haven't seen things on the differentiation, and actually I had that same thought too. I was like, gee, I wonder if it's better now. My best guess would be that the black smoke, there's probably more particulate matter. Again, just not reflecting light, it makes it darker. But I haven't seen a quantified table of white smoke to black smoke. Stay out of it if you can smell it.
Is there any way to is there an advantage toward mitigation, toward heating up the combustion? I know when you put more fuel to oxygen mixture, I assume it's a cooler temperature and there's more materials and particulates in it. But is there any advantage to attempting to make the fire hotter, to accelerate the burn, and to potentially degrade the particulates faster?
A lot of the pollutants, toxins, these chemicals are the product of incomplete combustion. Actually, shredded tires are used as fuel in some generation plants. That they extract the oil, but because they're burned more efficiently, they actually meet emission standards. So it'd be intuitive to say that, yes, the hotter the fire, the better. I think also for extended period of time, my recommendation would be get it over with now. They're going out doing operations, like was mentioned, take advantage of the favorable weather, get it done now. So maybe it lasts 1 week instead of 2 or 3 weeks smoldering. So.
Yeah, I'll just respond, Rick. I think when you look at it, some of the temperatures that we've recorded out there, the thermal imaging camera had a surface temperature of about 1,200 degrees. The infrared, I believe, was somewhere around 2,000 degrees. And so it's not for lack of temperature, but as the material burns, it develops kind of a crust. And so everything's kind of contained. And that's where we go back to that stir, burn, and cover. Open it up, break that crust, allow it to mix with the oxygen that's available to promote the combustion process and hence reduce the product that's out there.
Okay.
One of the biggest questions that I've heard from many people is, how long is this going to last?
Right.
I think originally one of the very first press releases said it was going to last about 3 days, and then 3 days later we said 3 more days. So people are just wondering, is this going to be 3 more days or the end of the month, or do we have any idea how long it's going to last?
It'll be more than 3 days. And as I said earlier, the two factors that'll determine how long this goes is the rate of burn, how much combustion we need to allow before we bury it, and then secondly, the weather we get during that time period, because we're working with clays out there, and if we get a rain, that really slows us down. It doesn't seem to put the fire out, but it does make it difficult to work with the clays. So that's where we want to work as quick as we can when we have good weather. And as I said, we completed about 1/7 of it last night and today.
But to be open about all of this discussion, this stir, burn, and cover may take, how many, 6-7 days to complete. But after you've covered, you still have the charring, the burning occurring potentially under the cover.
Right, we have the potential for flare-ups.
Okay, so then after that point, after they're done, the contractor's done with the stir, burn, and cover, you still have this product underneath the clay cover, still ignited, still burning to some degree, and that can cause some flare-ups. So we're going to have to continue to watch that, and that could occur until that product is extinguished entirely.
So that's probably the biggest unknown, is how long that'll take at this point.
Yes.
I'm going to ask a really dumb question. How can it burn under the ground where there isn't any oxygen? Are you pumping oxygen down there?
Well, the strategy is, of course, once we get it covered, is to essentially smother it.
Right.
But we don't want to have it, as the city manager pointed out, burning under there. So we want as much of it to burn as it can to release those smoke products.
No, my question is, how does it burn?
There is still oxygen and air entrained and trapped within pockets. It's not perfect. Even though we're putting that clay cap over it, it's not perfect. There's still the ability for air to be in there as well. It's extremely hot, and so it will take a period of time anyway before the oxygen is removed and it ultimately is smothered. It just takes time. So there is going to be air trapped in there, allowing it to continue to burn for a while.
Andy, I think you've answered the first question I have, which appeared actually in the newspaper this morning. And Iowa City residents said, well, why not just cover it with dirt? So it's an obvious solution, right? But it seems like that really is not viable because of the heat, and the material would keep burning, and there'd be the risk of flaring up and so on after things were covered. It's probably dangerous to try to cover it initially anyhow, but...
That's correct. We don't want a lot of unburned material there to smolder for weeks, if not months on end. And so, again, the recommended strategy of stirring and burning and covering seems to be the best practice. It's been tried by our contractor in a number of places, and he believes in it. And I believe his estimate was, back to Michelle's question, I think he estimated 7 full 12-hour days to really turn the corner on it. Now, again, that's all dependent on weather conditions, so we'll see how that plays.
My second question really would be directed toward Doug. I think, Doug, you described the air pollutant aspect of this pretty clearly and accurately, as best I can tell. But it's not clear to me where the air monitoring equipment is located, because so much depends on wind speed, wind direction, vertical dispersion, and distance of the population away from the source of the pollutant. So where are the monitors located? Is there one, for example, is there one near Irving Weber School?
The monitoring that we did was all on very portable handheld equipment. The State Hygienic Lab has what they call these SUMA canisters, and I don't know what SUMA stands for, but it pulls in air, so you take it out to where you want to grab the sample from. So these were grab samples. These weren't pieces of equipment that are out and parked there on a monitoring basis around the clock. So the strategy was looking at the models that were provided of where the plume was going to blow that day, and the concentration of contaminants. We would deploy. Someone would go out there, open the top on it, it would suck in the air, they'd take it back to the lab, analyze it. So we just tried to do that at various points
So they're
along the way.
instantaneous samples, right? Not
Well-
like 24-hour samples, but
Correct, because 24-hour samples actually are preferred when you're talking about full health risk. If we'd had if we'd had monitors out there taking a 24-hour sample and you average it, we would have got results that that actually lowered, because because the wind changes, and so then you're going to get fresh air. So, and that's how risk is assessed. It's by total dosage over time. So we're actually grabbing samples kind of in a worst case scenario, acting on that, being very conservative on that to be sure that health was protected. In addition to that, Lynn County lent us some other handheld equipment so we could get instantaneous particulate matter readings, also CO and CO2, and total VOCs. So we had staff going out and grabbing those samples, and yes, we did one at Weber School. We talked early on. I called. I can't remember if it was Saturday night or if it was Sunday, but early on with the superintendent, we were trying to think ahead of, those, particularly those special populations that might be affected, and they did ask us to go out there and do some sampling, and we did. Did that answer that?
Rick, you mentioned the oil being taken to the lagoon. What happens to it once it gets to the lagoon? Is it usable in any sense, or is it just recycled or dissipate? Or
That's what we're trying to determine right now. Our first priority is to get it off-site. And to do that on a quick basis, we're working with a company called Clean Harbors. And they are trucking it to a facility, an incinerator that's actually on the far side of Nebraska. So this stuff is going a long ways away. In the meantime, we're looking for other opportunities to see if there's anybody that could recycle this in one way or another, and probably do so at a lower cost than how we're getting rid of it right now. But our priority is safety, as Andy mentioned, and our priority is getting that off-site.
and the other question is, the number's been thrown around, $5 million. Is that coming out of the fund balance or insurance, or where's the money coming from?
We have put our insurance company on notice, and they are obviously researching our policies, and they've had an investigator out to the site. I think it's fair to say that I would like to have them respond to the claim without a whole lot of discussion about how we particularly feel about the claim. Let them respond to it, and then we'll go from there.
They keep throwing that money out, 5 or 6 million, whatever it is. But it's really going to cost a lot more than that. You're going to have to redo that cell, aren't you? Or what do you do with that? Or end it, or build a new cell, or it's going to be a lot more than that.
Well, that estimate of $4 to $6 million is a rough estimate at this time, and what it's based on is the cost of rebuilding that cell, plus an unknown cost of how much of that clay liner are we going to need to take out and dispose of, because very likely the pyrolytic oils have penetrated into the clay liner. Dave Elias has been out and poked around in there. Interestingly, the top is virtually turned to brick because the clay has been baked by the heat of the fire, and that's an interesting thing.
But we don't know, and won't for some time, the true cost of this event.
Right.
And obviously, that's secondary to the safety and extinguishment objectives. But the cost will be considerable, and it will have a budgetary impact.
And I can tell you that just the contractors we've hired, legal went through the contracts over the weekend. We signed off on the contracts, and there's some very expensive operations going on out there right now that are going to add to this cost, just to get us to the point where we get this completed and we can open up the opportunity to rebuild this cell for future use.
Okay.
Could I ask one more question?
Sure,
Doug,
sure.
just a comment. Just because some people can't see the smoke, I assume there's still a possibility of a particulate exposure risk. If the plume is all of a sudden dissipated, I assume that's chemical. You can't assume that just because the plume isn't around you, that you don't have a health hazard. I mean, a lot of people kind of drive around the plume and go, okay, I'm not even close to it, I don't see it, I'm fine. Could you comment on proximity to the plume and safety?
Well, the closer you are, I mean, it's just kind of it'll be geometric. So the closer you are to the plume, the more at risk you might be. Now, if you're talking about if you're upwind or if the plume's not over
I'm just saying if you can't see the smoke. I mean, is the particulate matter necessarily visible? I mean,
No, you're not going to be able to see particulate matter. Particulate matter is monitored. There is one continuous monitor in Iowa City at Hoover School. It's part of the DNR's monitoring of the state for compliance with EPA standards. So particulate matter is out there. It could be, and it's not always generated by combustion. It could be dust. I mean, there's a number of factors that affect that. So right, just because you don't see the plume doesn't mean you're in it. But this is what we'd call a point source. So there's particulate matter coming out of here. If you're upwind, you're out of the plume. With the smoke being lighter, there's still things coming out of there, and it's likely if you can smell it, you're in the plume, because those sulfur dioxides and other agents you're going to be able to smell for a while. But I would anticipate that as they get it covered and we reduce it, that risk is going down. We have suspended daily going out sampling as of now for the fact that we're not learning anything that we didn't already know, that if you're in the plume there's particulate matter there, et cetera. So we haven't changed our message based on the levels. The safest is if it's overhead, reduce activity, shelter in place, particularly if you're in one of those vulnerable categories. Shifting wind is good. I know it probably drives firefighters crazy, but in terms of, spreading it out and diluting the plume from a health risk, that's actually favorable.
The solution is always dilution.
You've heard that saying.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll look forward to continued updates on this. Now, I want to give an opportunity, if there are members of the audience who want to comment to us on this item on the agenda, I want to provide for that opportunity. We're not set up, this evening is not a forum, it's not an opportunity for Q&A, we just don't really have the setup for it, we've got a huge agenda before us. The public is being provided with information, as was indicated earlier, on a constant basis. And if people have questions that they're not getting answers for, we encourage you to contact City Hall, go to the website, call the central number. There's a lot of information out there for you, and there are people who can answer your questions. But having said that, if there's anyone who wants to make a comment to the council on this agenda item, consistent with how we handle other agenda items, I want to make that opportunity available. Okay, so we will move on then.